And now I'd like to welcome our expert panel for this week. In Israel, Sima Shine, head of the Iran program at the Institute for National Security Studies, and in Washington, D.C., Behnam bin Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you both for joining me. Sima, let's start from how in Tehran they look at us or at it. They've suffered a major cyber attack this week. Obviously, they suspect whom they suspect. They say the country is behind it. But what is Iran's goals when we look currently at the end of October, saying that they won't go back to the negotiations before November, and when they do so, it's only with Europe? What they are trying to achieve currently?
Well, this is the well-known bazaar procedures. They want to sell something, but they don't want to sell it cheaply, so they want to buy in the cheapest way possible, price possible. I think what Iran is doing is trying to waste more and more time and advance its nuclear program. I think that there is no reason, no concrete and justified reason to stay between August that they started, that Raisi was elected as the, not elected, he was elected in June, but in August he was already the president. So I don't see any reason to wait until the end of November, unless they want to have more time to enrich more, to enrich a larger scale, and that's what they are doing. And actually, there is a big question whether at the end of November, when they will resume, end or mid, when they will resume talks, if they resume, what does it mean? Are just coming to the talks in order to put the blame on the US, and they will put demands that will not be acceptable by the other side, and that's what I think will happen.
Yes.
The first round will be for nothing, and then at the end of the day, they will have more and more time, and they will not go back to the agreement.
So, Behnam, on to you. Same question. You agree that Iran is trying to buy time, and if so, what for?
Well, yes, indeed, Iran is trying to buy time. I agree with Dr. Shine almost completely, with one small caveat, and that caveat is in 2021, the types of nuclear facts on the ground that the regime has been building are somewhat more irreversible, I would say, than the regular, trying to increase the output of enrichment or bring in some new machines or things of this nature. So in this sense, Iran actually is learning from its continued nuclear escalation. And the more it learns from this escalation and the less it is stopped, the less of an incentive it actually has to simply do this escalation for political reasons. And in fact, it could actually open other doors for Tehran to want to go down. So in the short to medium term, this escalation on the ground, this political delaying is designed to become political leverage to be ultimately either traded away or to force premature Western concessions. Depending on how you count, 3 or 4 times already, the Iranians have called for some kind of premature concession, whether that's indirect sanctions relief or access to frozen funds or things of this nature. The more they do it, the more they want to create new risks on the ground to spook Washington into delivering this.
So staying with you, Behnam, what do the Americans are trying to achieve? Because it seems like they're a bit clueless. They're threatening or saying they have other options, but they don't do anything.
I think you really put your finger on the heart of the matter there, because since about mid-August, you've seen a whole series of different metaphors from the Biden administration about how the timeline for diplomacy is closing, the door for diplomacy is closing, but the behavior of Washington, the diplomatic behavior of Washington, does not actually reflect that tough talk. And my ultimate fear is, just as Iran created a crisis in August and September with monitoring and verification and pretended to solve that crisis, even though it didn't really solve it, to avoid censure at the IAEA Board of Governors, it is doing exactly the same thing with November. Now it says it's okay with indirect diplomacy at the end of November. Well, guess what? Also in November, the Iranians, there's going to be another IAEA Board of Governors meeting where the U.S. has an opportunity to put pressure. And I think the Iranians are, in fact, playing Washington. And as long as Washington doesn't transition to that plan B, we'll continue to see this rope-a-dope.
Yes, so Sima, you are our Israeli expert. How does it look from Jerusalem? What is Israel trying to achieve? seeing what's happening in Washington, what Behnam just mentioned?
I think Israel is quite worried. We hear it also from time to time. Worried not because we think we in Israel think that the Biden administration wants to allow Iran to get to the point where they want to get to, meaning being a threshold country or even more, but minimum threshold nuclear country. I think what worries Israel is the fact that the timeline and the perception of the threat is very different in Washington and in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, of course. So I do think that there is a common interest in the US and in Israel, but the way to achieve this interest of preventing Iran from being a nuclear threshold or being a nuclear country or in a situation where it can break out to the nuclear capability in a short time is the same goal, but the way there and the timeline is very different, and everything in Israel, the perception, the threat perception in Israel is much shorter, much closer than the one in the States.
So Sima Shine, staying with you, we've heard Israeli sources saying that the Israeli army, Israeli Air Force is getting ready with new operational options to attack Iran's sites if talks fail. How serious should we take those threats?
I think we should take them seriously because Israel, as we remember, was in a situation in 2010-11 that it built a military capability, and it was even debating within. We know today that there were people, the upper echelons, where Prime Minister and the Defense Minister specifically were debating the issue of whether to attack or not to attack the Iranians and the project, not the Iranians. But I think what happened is that the result of that was that the Obama administration decided to rush into negotiations with the Iranians without any attack on the program. I think Israel feels in a way that some years have passed. The security establishment was thinking that we will be in a different situation today, but what happened is that Trump decided to leave the agreement. Iran decided to continue its project much more advanced from the point of view of knowledge and technology than they were before. So I do think that Israel is preparing a proper military capability.
So Behnam, last word from you. Taking into consideration what Dr. Shine just said, Israel is serious, Israel means business. Give me an overall look from Iran taking this into consideration.
Well, Iran knows actually Israel not only has the capability to carry out a military strike, it's debatable the scale, scope, breadth, and reach of this strike, but it knows that more importantly, it has the will to carry this out. In the past few years in the U.S.-Iran contest in the Middle East, Iran knows America has the capability, but it's been rather debatable. And in the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal, the question of American will and staying power is there. So I think it's quite important for the Israelis to continue to train, to continue to talk about this option if everyone is united in desiring to prevent a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran, because the military option should always be on the table if you are actually committed to preventing it. Doesn't mean it necessarily has to be used, but the adversary has to know that you have exit options should talks, which haven't even begun, fail. So Iran knows that Israel has this capability.
Dr. Sima Shine in Israel, Behnam bin Taleblu in Washington, thank you so much both for joining us today.